Are you ready to explore the unknown? Dive into the world of the strange, mysterious, and unexplained with Eerie Expeditions magazine. Each issue is packed with spine-tingling tales, cutting-edge paranormal investigations, and exclusive insights into hauntings, cryptids, UFOs, and more. Whether you're a seasoned investigator or just love a good ghost story, Eerie Expeditions magazine has something for you. Join our growing community of truth seekers and adventure lovers. Subscribe today at EerieExpeditionsMagazine.com and unlock the secrets of the supernatural. Are you ready? That's EerieExpeditionsMagazine.com, where the extraordinary is just a click away. Dare to discover.
Whack for my daddy-o, whack for my daddy-o, there's whiskey in the jungle. He took the captain's money, and it was a pretty penny. He took the captain's money and he brought it home to Jenny. She sighed and she swore, no, never would she leave him. But devil take that woman, for you know she tricked him easy. Whack for my daddy-o, whack for my daddy-o, there's whiskey in the jungle. Drunk and weary, he went to Jenny's chamber to take his Jenny with him, but he never knew the danger. For at 6 or maybe 7, here walked Captain Farrell. He jumped up and fired his pistols, and he shot him with both barrels. especially in Jenny's chamber. But now he's stuck in prison. Now he's stuck with a ball and chain. Whack for my daddy, oh. Whack for my daddy, oh. There's whiskey in the jar. Whack for my daddy, oh. Whack for my daddy, oh. There's whiskey in the jar.
Hello, this is C.L. Thomas, and you are listening to the Gateway Podcast live on United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM New Orleans. And just for Sean Kelly, I decided to play Wild Whiskey, and that's his favorite song. It's the Whiskey Jar with the Wild Mountain Band. There's something going on with my screen right now. I'm not sure what's going on. It's not coming on for whatever reason. So let's see here. I don't know. It's all black for whatever reason. Yeah, it's dark. I don't know. The camera's not working, and I'm not sure why. It's a network problem, you guys. So just bear with me 1 second. Let me try to figure this out real quick. In the meantime, my guest tonight, her name is Morgan Daimler, and she is a renowned author and historian. And she's a historian. She does a lot of legends, and she works strictly with the Fae. And I think she might be the only world's foremost expert on the Fae that I know of. So she's going to come out here in just a minute. You've been listening to Sean Kelly with Into the Night, and again, I just played his favorite Irish song, since it is St. Paddy's Day. Whiskey in a Jar. And the band, it's called Wild Mountain. So he comes on again on Sundays. In case you've missed him, he'll come on again on 4 o'clock Eastern time. After this show tonight is Paratruth with Eric and Justin, and they're always a great lineup here, so stay tuned after this show. It's currently 89 degrees here in the valley, and I hope everyone's doing good. So I just got back from Milwaukee, Wisconsin this week, and yeah, you've seen what went on out there just now. So I'm so glad to be back in Las Vegas, where it's pool season. So also on Sunday, check out on my website at clthomas.org. Go to erieexpeditionsmagazine.com. I know everyone's been waiting for it for a long time. The magazine comes out Sunday. It is at print right now, being printed. So stay tuned for that. So in light of St. Paddy's Day, again, we are exploring the Fae with the only known expert on the Fae that I know of. Her name is Morgan Daimler, and she is in Canada. She teaches classes on Irish myth and magical practices. I can't talk tonight. The Faes and related subjects in the United States and internationally. Let me get her on here. Hi, Morgan. How are you?
Hello. I am good, and I'm glad to be here.
It's going to be kind of weird because my screen is black, and I'm not even sure why. I'm trying to figure it out right now, so I do apologize. I normally don't have this many problems.
That's okay. And I find anytime I do interviews about this topic, things get a little interesting.
I don't know if I should try to get out and go back in again. Maybe that'll work. But, I don't want this stream to end. That's the only thing.
That's fair.
So
I can hear you fine. I just can't see you.
Let me, Sean, can you figure this out real quick? So this is my co-host, Sean. Sean, you're live right now. Can you stay on for just a minute? I'm going to try to log back off and get back in.
I'm trying.
All right, I'll be right back, guys.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Just waiting for the host to come back. I'm really excited to talk with everyone tonight about this whole range of subjects, particularly the good folk or fairies, the fae, whatever we want to call them. It should be a good conversation and a great day to dive into this. And I'm not sure how much else I should say until the host comes back. So I guess I could tell you a little about me while we're waiting. I'm a folklorist. I have been studying fairies in an academic sense for a long time. I've done a bunch of university presentations about the subject, but I've also had my own personal experiences, and that's kind of my background is blending those two things together. And now I can see CL. Hi.
Yay, I'm here. Woo, I'm glad that got going. So I am so sorry that that's happened. I feel so bad. I'm always messing everybody up. I played Sean's favorite song and everything just went to hell and back from that. So
I seriously, when I talk about this subject, we end up having the weirdest tech issues a lot of times. So it's fine.
On the last show, I was telling everybody about don't cut down an apple tree today because the fae will haunt your house. Have you heard of this?
I haven't heard the apple tree specifically, but there's all sorts of variations. They can get very possessive of their trees.
Well, you know what? Now my computer has my computer is frozen. Isn't that nice?
I can still see you and hear you just fine.
So I guess I'm going to ask you all the questions. I had a whole bunch of questions for you, and I guess we're just going to wing it. So let's start out with, you just introduced yourself, did you?
Very briefly, yeah. I was trying to fill the time until you came back.
So you know all about the fae. You've been studying this. You do a lot of Irish folklore. How did you get into this?
Yep. So I'm Irish American. That's kind of the culture I grew up in. My grandfather was from Cork, and I have had my own experiences since I was very small. And as I got a little older, I started to dig into like the written material, the not quite academic at that point, but like the recorded stories, just because I wanted some more context, honestly. And it's such a fascinating subject. I found that the more I dug into it and the more I learned and the more I studied, the more I kind of fell in love with the topic. There's so much to it. I don't think you could ever really know everything there is to know about this subject. And I love that. It keeps it interesting.
In your research, how are fae best understood? Are they spirits? Are they deities? Are they another race entirely? What? I'm a little we just talked about this on the last show I was on, and they thought that there was a lot of speculation that it was only an Irish thing.
Yeah, the funny thing is, most of the like popular ideas about fairies are from England or English. The idea that they're tiny, the idea that they have wings, the idea that they have pointed ears, that's all kind of leaning into sort of English belief. In Irish, there's a different word for them, but the English translation would be fairies. And you can kind of find these sorts of beings in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, Cornwall, France, sort of all over the place. Iceland has beings that are very, very similar. So I personally think if you look at like human cultures around the globe, you're going to be able to find beings that would fit into this category, what we would call fairies, wherever you look. It just seems to be that they're everywhere, and humans are kind of aware of them everywhere, wherever they're found. So the Irish ones tend to be kind of popular, I think, because there's a lot of written material about Irish fairy beliefs. But yeah, definitely not exclusive to Ireland. And not meaning to talk too much, but to circle back to your first question as to what they are, all of the above, really. Fairy is kind of a catch-all term for a whole range of different individual specific kinds of beings. Some of them were once known as pagan gods, particularly like the kings and queens of fairy tend to have previously been pagan gods. Some of them are non-human spirits. They've never been human. Some of them are said to be the human dead or humans that were stolen by the fairies and turned into fairies. So yeah, there's a lot of ground to cover.
It's interesting. And so when you watch, there's been a lot of TV shows that came out over the last couple of years where there's hauntings and things like that caused by these little beings, and they almost paint them as if they're devilish little creatures. Is that the case, or is that what's going on with that?
I mean, certainly some of them could fit the category you're describing. One of the really interesting things about fairies is the range of appearances. So you have some that might be very small. You have some that look very human. We have a lot of stories about people encountering these beings and initially thinking it's another human and then kind of realizing, oh, this is something else is happening here. You have ones that can be corporeal. You have ones that can be incorporeal. So it's just a lot going on. I've watched quite a few of like the I don't want to say ghost hunting because that sounds rude to the ghosts, but people who are investigating haunted locations, and they'll be saying, oh, we have this ghost here, and I'll be watching and everything's happening. I'll be like, well, that's not a ghost though. That's a fairy, or that kind of spirit that's there. So it gets really complicated. There are definitely some that are more on the like malicious end of things, and some that are mischievous, and some that maybe could be more helpful. So lots of potential ways that encounters can go.
Do you do investigations?
I have occasionally in the past. I usually in those cases it's more like ghosts and hauntings kind of things. But I have visited sites. I go to Ireland every couple of years or so, and I have visited sites that had that sort of presence to them, as well as places that are more traditionally human ghost haunted.
Can you tell the difference between, because I've heard a lot of investigators say stuff like this, to where they can tell the energies if it's a human spirit or if it's an elemental.
I think that there's certain things that kind of I would look for, and when people are telling stories about a location or talking about things that are happening. In my personal experience, obviously you're going to have different opinions sometimes, but if objects are going missing, like physically disappearing and then reappearing in another place or reappearing like a significant amount of time later, that is usually fairies or something along those lines. When objects are getting moved, like things getting knocked over or pushed or slid across a table, that's usually more like human ghost kind of activity. Temperature drops are more human ghost. You don't really see that as much with fairies. You can get some similar things like batteries draining really quickly. I always used to say that was just ghosts. I was pretty adamant that like that's a way you can tell if it's ghosts that are there. But I have a very good friend in Ireland, and she went to a location that's very strongly connected to fairy belief over there, and all of her batteries kept draining, just draining and draining and draining. And so we were talking about it afterwards. I'm like, well, I guess I was wrong. No one's perfect. Everyone's wrong sometimes. Because apparently they can also drain batteries, or the location itself maybe was what was doing it. But yeah, so some things you see with both, and it can be a little confusing, but other things, like I said, the objects disappearing, with ghosts, in my experience, when you're investigating, if you're recording, you won't hear the ghost with your ears, but you'll hear them on the recording when you play it back, like EVPs. With fairies, you'll hear them with your ears when it's happening. You'll hear music or talking or whatever the sound is as it's happening. So sometimes that can be a little bit of a difference too.
Is there a such thing as people kind of antagonizing these things, like, cutting down a said tree? I think someone earlier in a different show said a hawthorn tree.
Yes.
If you do these sort of things and your house becomes kind of infested with the fae, like particularly angry fae, can they become dangerous?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of stories about why you don't want to antagonize them. I mean, and this goes like way back in folklore. If you look at the range of all the stories. So let me put it this way: their idea of like mischievous, like what the fairy equivalent of like a harmless prank would be, is I'll give you an example. There's this being called a puka. It's generally considered to be a type of fairy in Ireland, or sort of lumped into that category. And it would appear as a pony to drunk people trying to go home, from the pub at night. And it would convince the drunk person to get on it, to ride it, to go home. And then it would just take off and tear around, rearing and bucking and just completely terrifying this poor person, until either the person collapsed from fright and then they would kind of dump them in a ditch, or if the person out loud said something like, God save me, and then it would also throw them into a ditch. And that's their idea of like a fun prank.
Doesn't sound very fun. That sounds like impish.
Yeah, not so much fun for the human, fun for them. But we have a lot of stories of people who like damage a fairy tree, a hawthorn fairy tree. Hawthorn's the most common. And then it really does not end well for them. Usually they don't survive. I'm trying to be careful how I say this, because I know, we're being broadcast. I don't want to get anyone in any trouble. But yeah, when they're actually angry with you, the things they can do are like, madness, put an end to you, cause like significant illnesses, things like that. So generally, better idea to not antagonize or offend them. I actually warn people that do investigations of sites, because antagonizing ghosts tend to be really popular to get a reaction. You do not want to do that if you think you're dealing with fairies, because you're going to have massive problems if there actually are those beings around.
When you look at the idea of these fays or elementals, historically, like in old literature prior to Christianity, right? So this is before Christianity came in. Do you think that the idea of imps and devils kind of came from the fae in a way?
I definitely think the Christian idea of imps and devils kind of came in from older cultural beliefs. It's a little complicated to try to see where fairies would fit in the more like Irish UK kind of sense. But if we look at like Italy and pagan Italian concepts, they did have types of spirits. They were called daemons, but it's spelled different than the word demons. But they were sort of spirits that were thought to be around and potentially connected to people. And I do think that was probably a pretty significant influence on the later idea of demons. The words even kind of look a little bit the same and sound a little bit the same. So I do think there's a lot of crossover happening there. And it was really common actually in the early modern period. So from whatever, we'll say like 1500 up through, about 1900, early 20th century, for fairies to be directly equated to imps and to incubi, actually. So it's a very kind of blurry subject between the two.
I think it's one, though, that's not looked into enough, in a way.
Yeah. Especially, today a lot of people aren't aware of those connections. If you look at like folklore in specific places, if you look at like Ireland, they tend to view fairies as sort of like an angel that wasn't quite good enough for heaven through a Christian lens. If you go to Scotland, though, through a Christian lens, they'll say that they're demons that are not quite bad enough for hell. They're kind of, they're kind of in that middle territory.
What kind of demon must that be?
Yeah, it's sort of a demon light. Like, they're not gonna super torture you or eternal punishment, but they are probably gonna make you wish you hadn't gotten on that pony.
That's funny. Do you find, like with the investigation, I've heard an old tale about Beelzebub and flies, right? There's that old story that goes back. I think Hawthorne even wrote a short piece about Beelzebub and flies being drawn to it, that he named his cat Beelzebub. But anyway, long story short, do you find that these investigations kind of draw a lot of flies, and is there like a connection somehow?
That is a brave thing to name a cat. I just have to put that out of the way.
Yeah, true story. Hawthorne named his cat Beelzebub.
Yeah. Oh, I believe it. That's just cats are already an interesting category of being. That's a brave name to go with. Yeah, so I definitely think that when you're investigating locations, there are obviously human ghosts, there are fairy beings or elementals, whatever you want to call them in this context. And then there's like a third category of spirit, which I just tend to refer to as negative spirits. Some people would call them demons. They're the ones, like when you're doing investigations, people will talk about smelling rotten eggs, sulfur, or smelling like garbage, flies. The only time I've had experiences, or I've talked to people who had experiences where like mass amounts of flies just randomly appeared and showed up, it was always like the really negative kinds of spirits, the ones you really want to be super cautious with. When fairies are around, people tend to have experiences like hearing music, or I have talked to several people who have talked about having these spirits around and seeing a lot of moths. So I guess the moth would be like the fairy equivalent of the flies for the more dangerous spirits. I do think that there's certain animals or certain insects that are kind of more drawn to that kind of energy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's interesting. Do you have any specific stories of anybody that's been infested with the Fae from your research or from your personal experiences?
Oh, sure. In folklore, in the sort of the older stories, there are accounts in Ireland of people who, when you're building your house in Ireland, you're supposed to, traditionally, put marking sticks on the four corners where you're going to build the house. And the idea is you leave it overnight, and if you come back the next day and they're still standing, you're good to go. If they're not, and one has been knocked over, the belief is that you're putting it on what's called a fairy path, a fairy road. And you don't want to do that, because if you actually build the house, what's going to happen is you're going to get all of these beings coming in, usually at night, every night, and kind of try to pass through and causing you problems. There's also a story of a man who built his house partially into a fairy hill, which is like a main location they're kind of associated with and connected to in Ireland. And the same thing, you're kind of overlapping your home with their place. So you end up with a lot of that activity happening. And it's usually sort of very distressing, upsetting kind of activity. More like what we might equate with like poltergeists, for people who are familiar with that, like cabinets opening and slamming closed, furniture flying across the room, just very disruptive. Like you would not want to have to be dealing with this. And I did actually talk to someone once. This was probably maybe 12 or 13 years ago at this point. And she had bought a house that had been abandoned for a few years, had been empty for a few years. And there is this sort of idea that if you have a human structure and it's left unoccupied for a period of time, usually several years, that these spirits, these fairies will move in. They're kind of associated with that. So she had bought this house and was going in to kind of try to fix it up so she could move in, putting in a lot of iron, wrought iron, and fairies do not like iron. It's usually a way to kind of protect against them. Yeah. So she was basically going into this house, which she had bought, but was full of these kinds of spirits and doing some things that those kinds of spirits really didn't like, kind of putting in things that were meant to drive them out. And she actually ended up, she was standing on top of a retaining wall and felt an invisible presence, but felt something push her. And she fell and ended up breaking her arm, which was the point when she'd kind of reached out and was talking with me to try to figure out what to do, because obviously you don't want to live there with these spirits that are really upset with you and mean you harm, but it was her house. So you have to kind of try to find a way to work things out that everyone's happy with.
Interesting. So how do you solve that problem? If you have a house on their road, what happens then?
So when it's on a fairy road, there's not a ton that you can do. There was a traditional belief of always building the front door and the back door in a straight line so that any spirits that came in could just pass directly through and not be wandering around and kind of stuck in your house. In general, if you have a lot of these types of spirits around you in your home or just around you in general, and you're concerned or you think you've offended them, bribery is a big go-to option. When in doubt, bribe them. Dairy products are really the main one. Hello to your cat. The idea that, milk, butter, cream, things along those lines would be kind of left out for the good folk. And that could sort of help in some cases if they were unhappy with you, or you would have to go to a professional, someone who's sort of specialized in dealing with these kinds of beings, these kind of spirits. And I see a comment in the chat talking about there was a tradition in Ireland of burying the body of a cat under the threshold. They also used to do that with horse skulls, with the idea that it kind of protected the home. And there's a tradition as well. I don't want to offend your cat because I know she's right there with you. Putting the body of a cat in the walls of the house, like interring them there, again with the idea that it would protect against these sorts of spirits.
And they've actually, archaeologists actually found that kind of stuff throughout England, haven't they?
Yep. It's really interesting when you hear people talking about these sorts of stories and these things, and then you have archaeologists going and actually finding them, so you know that this actually was something that was done. It's not just a story. I love it when things work out that way, when like you have the archaeology and the stories and the folklore and then the modern accounts kind of all working together.
Yeah, I love that too, because then there's like evidence. I think even here in Nevada at the old Washoe Club, I think they might have found a cat in the walls there too.
Oh, that's cool. I've heard of the club, but I hadn't heard about the cat.
Yeah, I think there's a mummified cat there. I'm almost certain it's in a case, and I think it came out of the wall there.
Yeah, it used to be a pretty widespread practice in some communities, and definitely as people who were emigrating over from Ireland or from the UK came over to the US or to Canada, they would incorporate those things. So you do sometimes find them over here too.
Don't worry, Loki, we won't put you in the wall. When working with the Fae though, and they have like a really bad first of all, I know a lot of people who are building like gardens and things to try to bring these things in. Why would you want to do that if they're such a nuisance?
So generally speaking, particularly in Ireland, you traditionally would not want them, particularly in your home. You see more protections against them, like things to keep them out. In other places, sometimes the relationship can be a little different to these sorts of things. And you do see this sort of idea of wanting to deal with, usually they're referred to as like house spirits, which is not a concept you find in Ireland, but you find it other places. And the idea is that you want to have a house spirit in your house. It's a good thing. And you want to be on good terms with it. You know, maybe a weekly bowl of porridge or bowl of cream, you know, maybe bake them a little loaf of bread, leave it out for them once a week, something like that. And they would kind of help protect the home and be positive spirits. But unfortunately, and this is something we see from like English folklore, when you offend them or upset them, which is easy to do unintentionally, giving them a gift of clothing will horribly offend them, for example. Yeah, they don't like that. And then they become a much more dangerous sort of a spirit, and they can cause a lot of problems. And sometimes they'll be attached to a particular house, but a lot of times they're attached to a person or a family. So like there's an account from England with a being, it's called a boggart. And it was really just harassing this family. Again, kind of like poltergeist activity is what we would probably call it, you know, here. And really made it so miserable for the family that they decided to pack up and leave because they figured it was attached to the house, it would stay at the house. They got all their stuff packed up in a wagon and they're going down the road, leaving their house behind, and they hear the voice of this fairy, of this boggart, from their kind of packed items in the wagon, sort of saying something like, "Oh, I can't wait to see where we're moving." Because it was going with them. There was no escape.
Wow. So this idea, though, in America, does this happen in America and in Canada?
Yes. This surprises a lot of people. A lot of times when this subject comes up, I'll see people very adamantly saying, "No, absolutely not." But we actually have something like 400 years worth of folklore in Canada and the US and also in Mexico, actually, of these sort of, I guess you would say, European spirits, fairies, coming over and being seen and encountered and experienced here. There's even place names, particularly along the East Coast in Canada and the US, named after these types of beings, which is something we find, you know, back in Europe. And usually this is within communities that are coming from places like Ireland or Wales or Scotland, where, you know, the belief in this is really strong. And there is this idea that these beings will follow people. The banshee, which is pretty well known in Ireland, it's literally means fairy woman, but it's this sort of spirit that appears and forewarns of a death coming in a family. And they're sort of known to be attached to particular families, particular last names, with a Mac or with an O is what they say. But we have at least a dozen accounts that I've run across in the US and in Canada of people talking about hearing or experiencing a banshee. So definitely, you know, they kind of seem to have come over with the communities. As the community moves, the spirits, the fairies go with them in a lot of cases. So yeah, we find a surprisingly large amount of stories over here.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories. Even out here in the desert, there's a lot of, they don't call them the fae, they call them elementals.
Yep.
Within the Native American culture and some other thing, the Spanish culture that used to be here.
Yeah, there's a lot of different indigenous groups, First Nations in Canada and then indigenous groups in the US, who have beings that are very similar to the European fairies. Like there's one, they're called Makiowisug with the Mohegan cultures. And they, if you just describe them without saying that they're, you know, indigenous to the US and that this is what they're called, you would think they were talking about a European fairy. You know, they're like 2 feet tall. They look exactly like, you know, the human population around them, but they're about 2 feet tall. They don't like being stared at, which is something we find in a lot of Irish and Scottish folklore. They can be helpful, but they're very easily offended. And if they're offended, they're going to cause you problems. Make sure you know, never succeed at anything again, kind of stuff. But if you're on good terms with them, respectful to them, then they can help you. You know, they can do the opposite and be be very useful to you.
I kind of do want to talk about what they look like. There's a comment on here too I want to address. The gift of clothing to me is also horribly insulting. Well,
That's fair.
Foxy Joey's a funny guy. But this idea of they don't like to be clothed. So a lot of the people who talk about seeing these things, particularly in England, they describe them as this ugly little 2-foot or even smaller, hairy creature with big ears.
Yep, you see that in England. You'll also see in England them being described as like tiny and almost like childlike in appearance, sometimes with wings. In Ireland, it's a bit of a mixed bag because, again, there's a couple different types of beings that get put under this label. The puka, when it's in a human form, usually is described as being like a wizened old man kind of looking thing. They have the leprechaun, of course, which is supposed to be about 18 inches, half a meter tall. In more modern folk stories, usually described as an old man looking, beard, the whole deal. In the older material, because leprechauns actually go back to about the 8th, 9th century in Irish mythology, there were female leprechauns, male leprechauns. They had a king. They had poets. It was like a whole society. And they were actually originally connected to water. They were a kind of water spirit. So it's interesting to kind of see how that has changed and adapted. And then, of course, you have the Tinashi, the good people, who look very human. They're 5 to 6 feet tall. They don't have anything about them that immediately makes it clear they're not humans, but there's like an aura to them. An otherworldly or magical aura, and when they talk to people or they encounter people, they will know things they shouldn't be able to know. They'll be able to tell you things about yourself that they shouldn't know, and they have these abilities that that humans don't have. So yeah, it's a fascinatingly wide range that you can run into.
There's so many rabbit holes you can go down.
Yeah, this is why I love this subject, though, because it's like I said, you can study it for decades and still have more to learn.
Yeah, it's so true. So do you think it's dangerous that people are putting gnomes out in their yards? In a way.
I think as long as it's out in your yard, that's probably the better option. Gnomes are interesting. That's coming more from like Germanic kind of cultures. And from what I understand, they're seen as a more generally positive kind of spirit. Everything is positive unless you offend it. So some of them are much more easily offended than others. And they are thought to be like helpful with the yard and with the garden and kind of positive energy. And you also see them Nisa or Tamta, again in Germanic cultures, that are like house spirits or barn spirits that are helpful. So I think the gnome statues, as long as you're not like decorating inside your house with them, are probably okay. There's another big trend you'll see, fairy doors, which is actually the largest company that makes those is Irish, which I just think is really funny because, like I said, in Ireland, there's a belief that you really don't want to invite these spirits into your home, but they're sharing that with the rest of the world with fairy doors.
Yeah, I never even thought about that you're literally creating a gateway for them to come through.
Yeah, and then the thing that I always mention to people when that subject comes up, the fairy door specifically, is doors open both ways, and you really have no way to control what comes through that door. And then particularly with if you buy the manufactured fairy doors, it comes with a little contract that you sign, which you never want to do with anything from the other world, any kind of fairy, because they're very tricksy. They're like lawyers. They'll get you with the loopholes. Yeah, so I would personally be a little cautious about just having a door hanging out that anything can come through, but that's just me.
Cindy says she has gnomes inside and outside and loves them. I do have an interesting story. I used to live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I had an old barn on the property, and the barn was built, I think, 1920s. My house was 1920s too. And I was out there gardening one day and come across a wrought iron gnome about this big. It's an old antique wrought iron gnome. I thought it was the most interesting thing. So I dug it up, cleaned it up, and repainted it with black chalk paint. And it is like the creepiest statue ever. It's just so it's got this like feel to it that every time I look at it, it's just it of course it's in Vegas with me. I brought it with me, but it stays outside. It's not allowed inside. But
there's actually one of the more famous English accounts of fairies. It happened, I want to say, in 1974, but it was something in that range of time in the 70s. And it's called the Wollaton Gnomes. And it was a group of children who were playing in a park. Not related, they were just all friends, if I remember correctly. And school children. And they encountered what they described as a group, like a larger group, at least a dozen, of little gnomes riding in little cars. And initially they were kind of like, oh, this is really, interesting. Because these were like 10, 12-year-old kids. And you're seeing a bunch of little gnomes riding around in little race cars, basically. But once it got their attention, from how the story went, the gnomes ended up chasing the kids and kind of chased them out of the park. And then, of course, the kids went and told everyone. And it was a whole big thing at the time. And it's been written about a little bit since then. So you just reminded me of that when you mentioned wrought iron gnome. Then I was thinking gnomes and race cars. So
that's really funny. Well, I want to know, we're kind of running out of time already. Tell me about your work and where can people find your work at?
Sure. So I have a book coming out in a few weeks, the end of this month, called The Fairy Courts, which is looking at the idea of the fairies appearing in specific courts or groups, having kings and queens, that kind of thing, and sort of how that belief has come into more modern belief, as well as like fiction and gaming and such. And then I have a book on the wild hunt coming out in a few more months after that. So that's kind of what I have going on work-wise at the moment. You can find my work any place that sells books. I have written a lot of books, mostly about fairies and Irish mythology. I just completed a translation, because they translate Old and Middle Irish into English, of the Tonbo Cooley, which is one of the big, great Irish epics. That'll be out next year. So, yeah.
Exciting. Now, you teach, though, too, right?
I do. I do. I sort of have a dual identity with that. I do present papers at university conferences. So that's sort of the academic side of things. But then I also do speak and present and teach at like esoteric and pagan and witchcraft kind of conferences. So kind of both ends of the spectrum. And a lot of that is in person. Some of it is online. I'm kind of a little bit everywhere.
I did. There's an interesting question in the comments I kind of want to ask. They say they heard about fairies and plants that move back and forth like they're dancing to music. I'm not sure what the question is, but I kind of feel like I know what she's talking about. Like, is there a collective energy, so to speak, with the fae in the forest somehow?
Yep, a little bit. There's so many ways I could kind of interpret this question too that are all really fascinating. So I'm trying to decide which way to go.
Yeah, there's so many different ways you can go with that.
Yeah, I actually have a friend local to me, a friend, acquaintance kind of person, who got a video of that happening. She is like a massive gardener. Plants love her. And she was out talking to this assortment of plants that she had. And one single leaf in the middle started moving. And she even went over and looked. There was nothing around it. There were no insects. There were no animals. There was nothing. So she started like talking to it. And she'd ask a question and it would move to kind of answer the question. And she got a video of it. So I've seen this. It's really fascinating. yeah, it's this idea that like everything else is perfectly still. It's not the wind, it's not an animal, but the plant is still kind of moving. And one theory with that is because fairies can be invisible to humans, they can be all around us and people don't see them. That there is a fairy there, you just can't see it. It's moving the plant. The other idea, of course, would be that it's the plant. The plant has its own spirit, and that's kind of what's moving in that case.
There is a thing that I saw where somebody hooked up. It's like a vibrational device that you clip it to a plant leaf, and it goes through I think it's a symphonizer, and the plant can play music based on the energy that it's transferring through it. It's really cool.
There have been some really fascinating studies that have come out, I think, across the last year about plants and intelligence, essentially sentience, and the way that like forests will communicate with themselves, like one tree will communicate with the trees around it through the root system or through releasing particular chemicals. It's really interesting stuff, for sure.
Yeah, I think there's a book too that trees talk. I don't know the name of it, but there's a book out about that too. But Morgan, thank you so much I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's always fun talking about the Fae. And when your new book comes out, I'm going to have you back on to talk about
I'd love to come back and chat more.
I love that too.
For hours.
Yeah, there's so many rabbit holes you can go down with this. So
for sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
You've been listening to The Gateway, broadcast from the edge of the Mojave where the strange slips through the cracks, live from United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM, New Orleans. A special thank you to my guest, Morgan Daimler, for coming on and discussing the Fae, and thank you all for listening to the podcast. And again, I'm so sorry for the video mishaps earlier today, but I do hope you enjoyed the song that I played, especially Sean Kelly. Thank you all, and until next time.